Hello. Thanks so much, Carlo, and thanks also to Christopher White and to the Dean and the Office of Research and everybody for inviting me. So it's interesting to be seen instead of just heard every once in a while. For years, Ira Glass had this publicity photo. His standard publicity photo was him holding up a clipboard in front of his face, and on it was written, "Radio equals no pictures." And that's sort of how I feel whenever I have to come out in public. But I'm actually really pleased to be here and get a chance to talk to you guys. Although it is usually you people that I ask for answers, and so it'll be a little bit unusual for me to actually be trying to just talk to you and not be asking you things. So if I have any questions, I might just blurt them out. So I am, as you just heard, I was an English major. I was not, I don't have a background in science. So I really come at this beat thinking about stories. And actually here, I also come at this beat being very conscious of the clock. So I'm just going to turn on my little stopwatch. If I look down at this, it's not that I'm checking my email. I'm just looking at the clock. And so when I began this beat, I had the opportunity to kind of do whatever I wanted after the 848 gig wrapped up. And I was really drawn to science reporting for a lot of reasons. But I needed some guidance. And so we convened a summit. A panel of experts, scientists from institutions all over town, including Christopher White, chair of physics here, and basically asked them a whole bunch of questions. What is it that you like about coverage of science in the media? What do you hate about it? What drives you insane and makes you yell at the radio? What would you like to see more of? What are the unappreciated stuff? What are you working on? All these different questions. And as you can imagine, everybody talked at once, because that's what scientists do. And by the end of it, here's what I came away with. First of all, more, right? More of everything. More science coverage of every kind, because Chicago is this great, underappreciated capital of science in the country. There's just so many deep and powerful institutions, research institutions here in this town. And the other thing was that, I don't think any of them actually said this in so many words, but this is what I took away from it. A lot of the interesting stuff of science and the life of a scientist doesn't get attention. What gets attention are results, or findings, or finished products, things that get published, things that have been sort of well-tested and established. And there are indeed conventions in science journalism that lend themselves to that. And for good reason, right? We don't want to be publishing or publicizing hype or things that may or may not be true, or could be misleading, or don't have context. But one side effect of that is that you'll lose out on a lot of the stuff that comes before the paper gets published, before the findings get found, right? So everything from the kinds of questions that you come into it with, to the thought experiments that you conduct, to the speculation that you do that you don't tell anybody about, to the disappointments and the dead ends and the wrong turns and the illuminating failures and all that kind of stuff. Those are all dramatic in their own ways, and they often don't make it into the stories that get told to the public. So that is kind of what I took as my mission, to get into some of that backstory, as well as the surprises, and then what animates the scientists, what makes people excited and passionate about what you're doing. And that is really at the core of it for me, because I have come to believe that science emerges from some very basic human drives of curiosity, of the compulsion to understand the universe and our place in it, and ourselves, and that puts it in the company of some other pretty fundamental human pursuits, things like art and religion even, and philosophy. And as such, it really lends itself to stories. And those stories, I think, teach us about ourselves and our world in some really cool ways. And so I've sort of, in my own humble, sometimes half-assed way, try to go out and find those stories and tell them. And so basically today I'm going to tell you a few of those stories that I have found particularly meaningful or gotten a kick out of. And if you're a loyal listener, this will all be old, and I'm sorry. But I'm going to retell some of these to you and talk a little bit about some of the things that I feel like I've learned from not just the research, but the people that are doing it. So number one goes back to the 19th century, and a guy named Jean-Martin Sharko, who was practicing in a clinic called the Salpêtrière, which is an old gunpowder factory in Paris, and he was seeing all kinds of patients that had no hope, and no diagnosis. These were almost all neurological patients, and Sharko is sort of now known as the father of modern neurology. And he did all kinds of important stuff. You know, he named all these different diseases. He was the first to describe a number of different conditions, including what we now call Parkinson's disease, which he named after a guy whose name was Parkinson, it turns out. So he noticed something about his patients. Among the other careful observations that he did, he noticed that when his patients came in on a train or a carriage, you know, it was cobblestone roads back then, so traveling was a pretty bumpy affair. When people came in on one of those modes of transportation, they seemed to feel better for a while. And this got him thinking, what is it about a train ride, a carriage ride on a cobblestone road that might give some relief to a Parkinson's patient? And he didn't really know. He didn't concern himself too much about the mechanism. He just knew that there was this interesting correlation. And so he decided to try and replicate it in his clinic. And he built himself a chair. And it looks like a sort of classic, you know, Victorian armchair with little fringy things on it. And underneath it has a motor. And there were a few versions of it. One was, I think one was electric, one went on like kerosene or something. And you could just sort of pull the thing and the chair would just shake the bejesus out of whoever was sitting in it. And the idea was to like just shake the heck out of people and see if that helped their symptoms. And lo and behold, according to Sharko anyway, it did. It helped a number of people with their sleeplessness, with their stiffness, and a lot of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And so then he sort of worked on it and tweaked the chair and everything, and he made this, like, he thought, well, maybe we could just shake their brain. And so he made a big helmet that he put on people that looked like one of those big sort of Kaiser helmets. I don't even know how to describe it. It looks terrifying. And it would just shake somebody's head, and that didn't work as well. But anyway, it was this interesting sort of line of research that he tinkered with to the rest of his life. But Sharko died, and nobody really picked up on it. So now, fast forward about 110 years or so to where my story actually begins, with a guy named Christopher Getz, who is a neurologist at Rush University Medical Center and a great devotee of Jean-Martin Sharko. Getz is an eminent researcher in his own right, but he also has a real thing for Sharko. He's just a fanboy. You know, he has translated a number of Sharko's lectures and a bunch of unpublished work and published them. He's done historical pieces on him, and he became fascinated with this idea of the shaking chair. What was this all about? It sounds so primitive, right? This idea that you could just, you know, give someone relief from this debilitating disease just by shaking them up. And so he decided to try and take this old idea and subject it to the rigors of a modern clinical trial. Take this you know, primitive seeming concept and really bring to bear the tools of science on it. And so he went out and he bought a chair. It looks like a sort of a chaise lounge, and he hooked up a big subwoofer to it so it would just really shake you hard. And he got several dozen Parkinson's patients to undergo a trial with it. And I just thought that was really cool. I mean, it's an interesting idea. So the speculated mechanism behind it is really interesting. And in fact, I did this story like 2 years ago, and literally last week on Friday, I got a note from the folks at Rush saying they were publishing the results of this trial. And don't think it's embargoed, so I'm going to tell you, it didn't really work. It didn't really help. Correction, it did help, but it was a placebo effect, basically. The control group and the experimental group both had similar kinds of responses. But traditional science reporting probably would have stopped there or wouldn't have written about this at all, because it's kind of a null result. Or if nothing else, it sounds pretty boring. They tried this thing and it didn't work, and that's the story. But to me, the fascinating thing is really Christopher Getz's devotion to Sharko, his admiration of this man, this forefather of his in some sense. And if you talk to him about it, he really gets animated about it. I mean, Sharko, he described himself as like a photographer, because he's just he's an observer. He didn't really care so much about the mechanisms. It was just all about what works. And so to have Getz reach back across a century and apply modern scientific thinking to this formative idea, I found really interesting and compelling. So the story wasn't the result. It was the person. It was the scientist. It was the clever ape, if you will. So that was one of the first stories that I did in this series. And then shortly after that, I did another story about another Chicago area scientist it was pretty different. So there is a guy named J. Allen Hynek. Has somebody heard of him? You're betraying your side interests if you have. So he was the chair of astronomy at Northwestern University for some decades, and But before that, he had gotten involved in something called Project Blue Book, which was I believe it was a classified program. It was basically the U.S. military's investigation into the UFO phenomenon. So they engaged a scientist, a professional astronomer, to help them kind of get to the bottom of this. Like, is this really a thing? And Hynek went in as a skeptic, an absolute skeptic, as you know, in the way that would make sense to most people in this room, probably. And he said, sort of, this is probably just a case of post-war jitters, right? Here we are, it's after World War II. Aerial warfare is sort of a new thing, and there we have flying rockets in this war, and now people are still sort of like unwinding from World War II, and that must be what this is. So he spent his years after that, besides getting the department, a tiny department at Northwestern, sort of up and running and built up, going on interviewing people who said that they had been, encountered UFOs, either seen them, been abducted by them, have evidence of them, on interviewing these people. I mean, grandmothers in Louisiana and police officers in Arizona and just all over the place, and sort of largely debunking them, at least at the beginning. And he was the guy that actually originated. Have you ever heard of the thing where people explain these UFOs as saying, oh, they're probably swamp gas? That was Hynek's legacy. But as time went on, something began to change, and he began to transform. And he began to become a believer. And by the late 1970s, or really the early 1970s, he had become, if not exactly an advocate of sort of ETs, he became a full-throated defender of the UFO crowd, and a real problem and a thorn in the side for traditional science. And in fact, I think Northwestern is still a little touchy about it. I went in there to go look at their I wanted to look at their archives, and I wanted to interview somebody at the observatory that he ran for many years, and they said, no, that's okay. You can do it by phone. So in any case, it was just an interesting transformation for this guy, who was a classical, sort of a traditionally trained mainstream scientist who had become gradually over the years toward the fringe. And meanwhile, there's another part of this story, a parallel or even opposite mirror image story in the person of a guy named Mark Hammergren, who I know has lectured here before, so maybe some of you know him. He's also at the Adler Planetarium, also an astronomer. In fact, he succeeded Hynek in doing one of the programs at the Adler. He grew up idolizing J. Allen Hynek. He had read Hynek's books. He was a big UFO buff. He had all these ideas and theories and conspiracy theories and so on, so he thought he would go into astronomy. As he became more educated and better trained and became a real, a rigorous scientist and researcher in his own right, he went the opposite way. He went from believer to skeptic and came to, really make almost make a mission out of debunking this stuff that wasn't based on evidence, and particularly UFO phenomena. So they had this split, this tale of two guys. And Hammergren's take on Hynek is basically that Hynek met all these nice people, these nice little grannies, and all these different people across the country who had said that they had seen UFOs, and they just didn't seem crazy, or they didn't seem stupid, or they didn't seem like they were lying. And he didn't want to believe any of those things. And so maybe he just kind of came around to, through exposure to all these people, to sympathize with them and perhaps come a little unmoored in his own scientific grounding as well. And so I just find these two men, their parallel stories, or rather their mirror image stories, so interesting. And it also raises some interesting questions for science. The sort of rap from the fringe, or from, say, out of the mainstream beliefs like ufology, is that science dogmatically ignores them. That science makes these claims to be objective and to come in this without prejudice, but really science is full of biases and full of orthodoxy that prevents them from giving a fair shake to their brand of research, right? And of course, you could probably all fill in the blanks of the opposite argument that there is evidence, then the evidence is there's a long record of failure to prove when it comes to UFOs and everything. But nevertheless, if you listen to Hynek, it just raises some interesting questions about the line, the balancing act, for all of us when it comes to dismissing ideas, what's worth investigating, what deserves to be dismissed and run out on a rail. And those questions aren't always as straightforward as we might like to think. So it's just one of the gray areas that I've sort of touched on ever so gently in doing the kind of work that I've done. So that was a great story that I really enjoyed doing. Another story that may sound similarly crazy. And that's the idea, although probably not to a lot of people in this room because I see a lot of physicists out here. This might sound completely normal to you guys. But the idea that the world, the universe, is flat. That the universe is two-dimensional. And that what we are actually living in is a kind of holographic projection, maybe off of a light sheet somewhere, or maybe off of the expanding horizon of the universe, and that really the reality exists in two dimensions, sort of inscribed on the walls of the universe in some way. A real mind-bender for those of us who aren't familiar with black hole physics and stuff like that. And I was really compelled by this story, and I've tried to tell it twice. And I'll tell you a little bit about each time, except, the first, it's easy to tell you about the first time. The first time was basically a failure, right? This was, and actually the first Clever Apes I did, I thought, people will love this stuff. And so I went to Craig Hogan, who is an astrophysicist at the University of Chicago and also at Fermilab, who's done a lot of work on this, and said, okay, let's explain this in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. And that was pretty hard. Like, you have to really go back. You got to go way back. You got to understand black holes. You have to understand event horizons. You have to understand how information is, maybe conserved at the event horizon, and Hawking radiation and stuff. And like I'm saying it, but I don't really know what all this stuff means, and neither did my listeners. And it didn't go that well. Craig did an admirable job. Nothing against him. It was really an impossible project to try and cram this into 3.5 minutes. But something about it ate away at me. I just thought it was still so compelling. And so a little over a year later, I returned to it. And I took a little bit of a different tack. The idea this time is that Craig is building an experimental apparatus to try and test this theory out at Fermilab. And so I went and visited it and tried to understand it. And the story became this. Physics, high order, really cutting edge physics, and particularly cosmology, has gotten so far ahead of itself in some ways that it's not experimentally verifiable, right? This is sort of the rap on string theory and on, quantum loop cosmology, and some of these different theories are by their very nature untestable, it would seem. And that obviously is a problem for science. This discipline that rests on testability and verifying results and being able to repeat them, and you gotta be able to show it. You don't get just to wave your hands and say stuff. So Craig very cleverly, probably, devised this machine to figure out if this was in fact true, if this theory, proves out. And he used actually pretty old technology called an interferometer. It's basically a couple of lasers at right angles. Don't really understand how it works, but the idea is that if they're calibrated in this very, very fine way, the sensitivity goes down to like an attometer, so a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of space, to where you can start to understand what the fabric of space-time looks like. And what he's looking for is a kind of jitter, or a jumpiness, a blur. And that would suggest that maybe what we are in is somehow a slightly lower resolution projection from the edge of the universe or wherever that stuff is. And just the idea that you could find a way to do kind of an end run around the problems of testing this stuff. Because I spoke to a number of string theorists and stuff like that, and they said, oh, sure, the holographic principle, yeah, everybody knows that, sure, sure. Oh, no, you can't test it. You'd have to have a particle accelerator the size of the Milky Way. They all said that. And Craig, instead of doing that, has like a 40-meter machine with a couple of lasers and a couple of $1 million, and he's just doing this very under the radar. I mean, it's still Fermilab, right? It's not like that under the radar. But compared to the big science model, this is a tiny, tiny shoestring operation. And he thinks it will show one way or the other whether or not this theory is true. I don't know if it'll work, but what I know is that it just struck me as a smart approach to not accept the idea that it wasn't testable, except by calculations. That you can, if you work at it, you can often develop some kind of experimental apparatus that might actually show you some results. And it just taught me a lot about how the scientific method works and how science gets practiced. And if you see a trend here, it is that I have been learning and taking great pleasure and joy and wonder from understanding how the scientific method unfolds and trying to communicate that to people in all of these stories. And this story about that clever way to get around the untestability of a concept was really compelling to me. Now, and there's another story that I did pretty recently on a similar, that had a similar bent. It was about devising a clever way to test some results, some seemingly contradictory results. So I loved this story, actually. This story lights me on fire, but a lot of people didn't love it, or at least people in my life, like my editor and my wife. But I think you guys are going to get it, okay? Okay, here it goes. So it comes from this, this citizen science initiative. And maybe that's a term that you guys know. It's this sort of idea you use kind of crowdsourcing to gather data for some, to generate enough data to make some sense of for some big problem. And in this case, it was about, this was an astronomy project, and it was called the Galaxy Zoo. And some of you probably have heard of the Galaxy Zoo, I'm guessing. What it does is basically take pictures of galaxies from the Hubble or other telescopes, hundreds of thousands, I think millions of pictures, piles them all online, and lets people look at them and describe them. Because the thing is that, the astronomers, they want to know some characteristics of these galaxies that are hard for just a computer or an automated sort of thing to figure out. They want to know, is it edge on, is it face on, is it spiral or elliptical? If it's spiral, where are the arms going? Are there any weird things in the picture? Is there a bar? A lot of things that that is just hard for a computer to capture. So you need eyeballs on these things. And so they created this thing and they invited the public to look online. You do a pretty simple thing. You categorize the galaxy. You write some of the characteristics. You click some boxes, and then that all gets plowed into this big database that they can then crunch up. And they got incredible response to this. Many, many, many tens of thousands of people went online and did it. So a little while into this, they were starting to pile up some, a pretty significant amount of data, and they decided to start, slicing and dicing it and checking it out. And they made a very weird and disturbing discovery. They were finding significantly more counterclockwise galaxies than clockwise galaxies, which is weird. I mean, there's nothing in the universe that would bias the results that way. It should be, when you think about it, we're supposed to be in a not special place in the universe, right? And so it should be just a random distribution, because it all depends on just what way you're looking at the galaxies. So if there's more of one than the other, that suggests something pretty disturbing. And Chris Lintott is the guy who is sort of leading this at the Adler, who's a fascinating guy in his own right. He hosts a show on the BBC in the UK. He researches at Oxford. And he wrote a book on a cosmology book with one of the members of the band Queen. Fascinating guy. So he said, look, this doesn't make any sense. It would only make sense if one of the following were true. A, there's something like a magnetic field that spans the entire universe. And if so, that would undo everything we thought we knew. It might make sense if the universe were small and shaped like a donut. And as he put it, that's pretty much exactly as crazy as it sounds, because it's neither of those things. So what is going on here? It just didn't seem to make sense. And they spent a while kind of wringing their hands about it. And then I thought, okay, if this was any other result from any other sort of traditional piece of science equipment, a telescope, a microscope, a particle accelerator, or whatever, they would strip it down, check everything out, put it all back together, and try again. We can't do that when your implement is effectively human beings, tens of thousands of human beings. But he figured out you can sort of calibrate the instrument in a very clever way. What they did was they just took all those pictures of galaxies and flipped them all 180 degrees. And the idea was that if there really were more counterclockwise galaxies in the universe than clockwise, when you flip them, you should get more clockwise than counterclockwise, right? Makes sense. What they found was, in fact, once they flipped them, nope, they were still getting more counterclockwise than clockwise. So, as Lintott put it, it's maybe not the universe that's odd, it's us that's odd. There's a problem or a bias in our eyes or in our brains that seems to make us recognize counterclockwise galaxies more easily than clockwise. And he could have left it there because basically then he had accomplished what he needed to do. They figured out the effect, they figured out the size of it, they could measure it, account for it, carry on. But he got really interested in, like, why is this? What's going on here? And so he started talking to psychologists and neuroscientists and, primatologists. There's a guy in New York who said spends his days showing spirals to monkeys, and he talked to a cognitive psychologist who pointed him in the direction of this famous illusion, the ballerina illusion, which if you Google you can find. It's basically just sort of a fixed, like a kind of a cutout paper image of a ballerina spinning around rapidly. And if you stare at it for a while, it will flip. It will appear to flip directions on you. And it's really not doing anything. It's your brain or your eyes flipping it. And I'm not really sure what the neuroscience underlying it is, although he thinks it has something to do with the way that the hemispheres talk to each other or whatever. But he got to the bottom of it in a really, I think, clever way. And as he put it, they wouldn't let him put this in the paper, but it reminded him of this quote from Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which is something like, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in the stars, but in ourselves." So, lastly, how am I doing on time? I'm not used to talking for 45 minutes. I'm used to talking for like 3 minutes. Yeah, if we could could we cut to traffic? That'd be great. We're going to maybe leave some time for Q&A at the end to fill. But one more story. This was another one of the early ones that I did, and it's one that's very personal for me because it's about a dear friend of mine whose name is Alex Karsmar, or Alexander Karsmar. He is 95 years old, and the story I did at the time he was 93 was basically how he is thinking about death, how he's thinking about the approach of his own demise. Now, Alex isn't just any 95-year-old. He's got a bunch of things that make him unique, and I will tell you them. Number one, the guy's full of beans, right? He is sharp, he's hilarious, he's tells all kinds, he's extremely witty, extremely well-read, and does everything that he ever did. He still drives, he still works out, he still paints, he still flies up and down the spiral staircase in his house. He and his wife, Marion, still go to concerts and art museums and all kinds of different things. I mean, the guy is incredibly active. In a lot of ways more active than me, especially for a retired guy. He's also still writing. He does everything. He's an amazing guy. He is also, his brain is being studied in this interesting study at Northwestern University called the Super Agers Study. And they're looking at all these people who are over 80 who are still highly accomplished, high functioning, and trying to understand what is it about their brains that allows them to continue functioning at this high level when most of us do not. It's kind of the flip side of looking at pathological brains. Normally you look at an Alzheimer's brain, you figure out what's wrong with it. This is a way to look at a high-functioning brain and try and figure out what's right about it or what's different about it. So he's in that study. He gets MRIs and takes clinical exams, and then when he dies, he's going to donate his brain to this study, although he told me that he thinks he's promised his brain to like 3 different brain banks. So they're going to have to fight over it when he dies. Another interesting thing about Alex is that he is a brain scientist himself. He was chair of the pharmacology department at Loyola University Medical Center, or at the med school, for like 20 or 30 years. He is one of the renowned authorities on the cholinergic system, this network in the brain, and he's a very highly regarded neuroscientist in his own right. The last thing I'll tell you is that he also has a kind of a side obsession besides the cholinergic system. He has long been preoccupied with the nature of the self, or self-consciousness, and the neurological correlates of that. What is the I, as in capital I? That's this question that he's been, since the early 80s, has been kind of fixated on. And so he's crossing disciplines. He's looking at neuroscience, but also looking at computer science and artificial intelligence and philosophy and all these different disciplines, and trying to sort of understand and incorporate them in some way to understand what the neurological basis of selfness is. And so here's a guy, sharp as hell, 95 years old, brain scientist. Also, I wouldn't call him a Holocaust survivor, but he escaped he escaped Poland under the Nazis. I mean, it's an incredible life story. What a fascinating perspective he must have on death. And when I did the story, I was kind of building up to that. You know, it's like an awkward thing to talk to an older person about death. And when the time came, I sort of, hit him with the questions. And the answer was that, like, he just didn't think about it that much. He had other stuff to do, He's like, I'm not doing this, he said. I'm not interested in the eye because I want to know what will remain after I die. That is not what I'm doing it for. I'm doing it because it is interesting to me as a basic question. And his other answer to my question was to tell me about this trip he took to the symphony. And this is in the story, and he talks about this experience he had listening to Yana Vianovsky at the CSO, and how moving it was, and how stirring it was emotionally, and how it made him cry, and spoke to him, and said, that, my answer to death is that. I don't think about death because I have to think about that. I had breakfast with him yesterday, and his wife, Marion, who they've been married for 60-odd years or whatever, and a few other friends. And in the course of brunch, Marion sort of happily announced, "Oh, we've all just, Nikki and I, they call him Nikki. Nikki and I decided that we want to die in a plane crash. That's how we want to go." And I sort of said, "Marion, first of all, why? And second of all, how would you organize that?" And she gleefully said, "Oh, we just have to find a drunk pilot." So clearly, like, they've thought about it here and there. But what I learned about Alex is that it's not just that he likes to do fun stuff and he loves life, although those are certainly true, but it's also these questions that he's asking that are so important to him that sort of, that defines him in a way that death doesn't really enter into it. When it happens, it happens. He's not in denial of it. At least I don't think so. But it's really about these questions. And even though he has come to believe that he won't find the answers to these questions, not just because he's 95 years old, but he also thinks that, and this is all getting into the specifics, but he thinks basically, quantum theory and quantum physics and relativity need to be reconciled before we can really understand what's going on in our brains. You got me. But the point is that it's not even that he's hoping for a result. It's just the questions, the inquiry that drive him and compel him to go on and on and on and on, even when a lot of other people would be kicking back by now. And I've just learned, this is emotional for me because, we saw him yesterday, and I'm moving in a week and a half, and I might not ever see the guy again. And I've learned a lot from him about what it is to be a scientist and to be a full human being. So, onward. This is kind of my last act as a Chicago science reporter, and so that's a little weird for me. But I was asked to talk a little bit about some advice for scientists or science students in communicating what you do to people like me or just to the general public. And so my big picture advice is just don't be afraid of the stories. Don't shy away from the part of your work that tells a story. When you think about it, the scientific method in and of itself is a narrative, right? There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's kind of a premise, some rising action. There's tension. Is it going to work? Is it going to not work? Is it going to, support the hypothesis or not? There is climax, and then there's reflection in our conclusion section. And there's drama in that. There's no shame in telling the story of your work. And, we do this for a reason, right? That's the other piece of it. Don't be afraid to talk about what it is about your work that turns you on. That really matters to people. It may seem irrelevant, and it may indeed be irrelevant in some contexts. You're not going to put that in your journal article, right? But when you're talking to the general public, that stuff really does make a difference. Why do you care? What difference does this make? Pull back a little bit and explain what it is about the stuff that compels you as a person, and people will relate to that. And it may, it may sound unscientific. There may be something in here that you want to resist a little bit because it's not rigorous. But if I could tell you how many eminent scientists I've heard talk about the beauty in the kind of work that they do and the beauty that they get glimpses of by doing the research that they do. You know, it's all over the place, and it's part of the culture of science. And in fact, no less a light than IIT's own emeritus, Leon Letterman, told me that so often it's the aesthetics driving the science, which I was surprised to hear. But he said, no, of course it is. It's the beauty of the universe being knowable, being understandable. The idea that we have from tools of our own devising can get a glimpse into the workings of ourselves and the universe. That is beautiful. And that stuff tells stories. And I think that the stories that science tells also teach us a lot about ourselves. So don't be afraid of the stories. Thank you.